You're listening to the Hour of History podcast with your host Stephen Ballman and producer James Orwell. Your Hour of History begins right now.
Hey, welcome to the Hour of History. I'm Stephen Bauman.
And I'm Mathias Fueling, and today we are talking about a subject that is on a lot of people's minds.
And in a lot of people's hearts.
China.
No, I'm just kidding. I don't know.
Also in President Trump's mind.
China. We had to say it. Now that that's out of the way, good. We can get down to business. Right?
We can.
Because we have an hour to talk about one of the biggest nations in the world.
Not like biggest population wise. Or is India a little bit more populous? Or are they like it's China. China has the most population.
But everyone always says, "Oh, India's going to catch them." Imagine a India without partition. Though we're talking.
That's true.
With Bangladesh,
India, Pakistan, Bangladesh would be the world's most populous. But it wasn't to be. China is the most populous country. Territory-wise, it's what? Third?
Yeah, no, I think it's second. Oh, no, Russia, Canada, China. Yeah.
What about Brazil?
What about them? No one ever thinks about South America, but it's so important.
But it's big. Well, like, okay, so big countries, right? America, Canada, Russia, China, Brazil. It's got to be Australia.
Australia's pretty
So those are like the six probably biggest countries. Anyways.
China, only Russia has more neighbors than China.
Oh.
I think Russia has like 13 neighbors.
And
China has just one fewer. I remember because this was a huge debate in one of my undergrad courses where a kid challenged the professor and was like, "No, I think China has more." And
you had to separately get out a map and
yeah. So anyway,
I know. Anyways, all of which is to say, China is very large, both land and population wise, and not just for that reason. It is probably the most important nation in the world. Maybe even more important than the United States right now. Absolutely. In terms of the future of the planet.
It is, yeah. And you think about how not just how many people they have, but also the growing economic influence and economic power. And that hasn't always been the case for this country, the People's Republic of China. So maybe we should start from... there was a China before the People's Republic of China. In 1911, the Republic of China was founded, Sun Yat-sen, and but it was never going to last. It was a warlords, a loose organization, and sort of how we talked about with Russia, just peasants, illiterate peasants everywhere.
Hundreds of millions of illiterate peasants. Really, really quite mind-boggling. But also, we should mention that China, as we think of it, is quite new. The idea that there is like a territorial part of the world is China is pretty new. Because what was there before the Republic of China? For like thousands of years.
Dynasties with shifting borders. And that's the thing about the Republic is even after the Republic of China is established, the borders aren't really established. In Manchuria, it's invaded by Japan.
Is it the Soviet Union? Is it Russia? Yeah. Is it Japanese? Is it Korean? Who knows?
And not to mention, and interestingly, the first flag of the Republic of China has 5 distinct colors, and each of those 5 colors is supposed to represent the different ethnicities of China, and sort of like saying that there was going to be an equality within the Republic, but in reality that's never been the case. The Han Chinese far outnumbered.
So this is important, right? Because when we think of China and we look at people and they're like, "Oh, he looks Chinese," this does not in any way correspond.
Are those your friends who say that?
hypothetical friends, right? But this is like in no way corresponds to the actual state of China as a nation. China was very much a state of flux for a long time, right? What we think of now as China was just the location of various empires that we in the West call the Chinese empires. And yet these empires weren't just quote-unquote Chinese people, because who are the quote-unquote Chinese people today?
Right.
They are Han. They are Han Chinese, and yet China is an enormous multi-ethnic society.
Right, and it's multi-ethnic, multilingual, you know, and it was sort of the same thing. We mentioned it a little bit with Russia, where they're invited to these giant Communist Party meetings to wear traditional garb that is decided for them by the Han Chinese.
But this is important because we have a very monolithic conception of China here in the United States, right? We think like China, we're like, oh yeah, everyone looks the same, everybody is Chinese, you know, everybody, you know, eats the same food, right? Well, I'm saying like the very stereotypical kind of American view is like China is a monolithic, homogenous society, and that is in actually no way the case.
And in fact, even just walking down the street in Chinatown, Philadelphia, you can hear many different languages. You'll hear Cantonese, you'll hear Mandarin.
Well, we should say is that this is also Chinese. The language itself isn't monolithic, because what are the divisions?
There is no
as you
Chinese.
There's numerous. But what are the differences? So there's Cantonese and Mandarin. But
so Cantonese and Mandarin are not transparent language. Like, so if you were speaking to me in Cantonese and I was speaking to you in Mandarin, we would not understand.
Is there like an equivalent, like English versus German type of differentiation?
Yeah, so they're the same language family, but they're not. Yeah, you.
So just like in my eyes, right? I would just say, oh, they're both like Chinese characters. But not the case. Maybe in the same way someone from China who didn't know any other language, say someone who spoke Mandarin, knew Mandarin, would look at German and English and say, well, they're both using the Latin alphabet, so what's the difference?
Right, and that's where China also gets even a little bit more complicated, is because Mao Zedong, the first leader of the People's Republic of China, he decided to reform all the characters to help the peasants learn, to make the peasants literate. So he had these massive population of illiterate peasants, and he said, okay, we're going to develop simplified Chinese. And so he and the Communist Party took thousands of Chinese characters and they simplified them. Just made them easier to learn. But the problem is there's still millions of Chinese in Taiwan, which calls itself the Republic of China, and Hong Kong, which at the time was a British colony, Macau, which at the time was a Portuguese colony.
Emigres, Chinese communities in the United States, Chinese communities everywhere around the world.
They decided to stick with the old characters.
So the Chinese that is spoken in America oftentimes is different from the Chinese, Mandarin Chinese, I should say, spoken in mainland China.
Yeah, and now you hear more and more Mandarin coming to America as more Chinese begin to travel, and these are mainland Chinese, begin to travel and come to the United States. But back when the Chinatowns were established, and you think of like Chinatown, San Francisco, we're talking Cantonese-speaking communities that came from immigration from southern China, where the Republic was founded.
Okay, so what would we call... So it's Mandarin Chinese that Mao simplified.
Yeah.
So what do we call Mandarin pre-Mao?
Well,
do you call it like High Mandarin?
No. Well, see, Mandarin or Cantonese are both written with the same Chinese characters. Oh. So they would see the character for anything, and it would just be a different word.
But what do you call like the language before Mao? Like, is there a specific word to differentiate Chinese pre and post Mao? The simplification of the language?
Well, just simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese.
And traditional Chinese. Oh,
and that's just in reference to the characters, not the actual language. So that's just the writing system.
Which is like only the beginning of this. Well, which is to say, China is much more complex than is commonly thought.
And the reforms of the Communist Party make it even more complex, and even though they're simplifying, it changes, it puts China on sort of a divergent path that changes the culture, as any government does. Yeah.
So where is Cantonese spoken then in China?
In southern China.
So why is it spoken there? Like, when did they split? I'm really fascinated.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because this is something because I know people like saying, well, I know Chinese, and then they almost always mean they know Mandarin. Right. But if occasionally you run into someone who knows Cantonese, I'm always wondering, like, yeah, how did this happen?
Well, it just sort of like any language happens, right? The local language sort of takes over
under the imperial different Chinese Empire.
Right, but we need to remember that imperial leaders were mostly Manchu, so they're speaking Manchurian, different language.
And the Manchurian is a different thing.
Totally different language. It has a different script. Yeah.
See, this is all to show, right? China is not monolithic. It's not homogenous.
Right, and it's not even. We think the United States is different with the South and the East and the West Coast.
Imagine if in the southern United States they spoke an entirely different language.
And then you start considering things like Xinjiang province, where the Uyghurs
which is in the far, far west of the country,
and they're Islamic Chinese with Turkic ethnic background. A lot of them learned initially to write their language on Arabic script, so they're Chinese.
And they are not Han. They look completely different.
Yeah.
They wear different clothes.
Right. And so, I would go to, when I taught in China, I would go to get chuar, which is like a meat stick barbecue kind of thing, and I would get served chuar by these blue-eyed Chinese Muslims.
But so wait, you should give some background. So when were you in China?
Yeah, so I just taught very briefly in China in 2011, and I taught in northeast China. So
wow!
So
that's awesome. So you were in China. You were not in like one of these big coastal cities. You were in the heart.
Right. Yeah, in Jilin City, and actually, so Jilin and the northern city above it, Changchun, which is like really the Detroit of China. It's the auto manufacturing center, and it's a small town of 10 million people.
I know, like, who's heard of this place?
But Jilin is just sort of a perfect case for China because it's there when the Japanese take over Manchuria. So it's the capital of Manchukuo, so the puppet state of the Japanese Empire.
Okay.
So there's a heavily Japanese influence. Japan starts setting settlers there to farm around Jilin. There's Manchurian remnants from previous dynasties up north. There's also Koreans. So Kim Il-sung, the first dictator of North Korea, actually goes to middle school in Jilin City. Which all is a way of saying China has these boundaries that are constantly being crossed from the north, from Russia, from the south, from China, from Japan.
It's true. And the northern border is usually considered the Amur River or Amur River?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, which is sort of like, right, it's so far in like the heart of Eurasia that most Americans don't even think about it.
Don't even consider it.
But these are very important, as you were saying, right? There's a city of 10 million people in China that no one's heard of. Whereas like if there's a city of 10 million in America, everybody knows about it, right?
Brooklyn,
it's Brooklyn. It's LA.
New York City.
It's New York City. It's Atlanta, right?
It's mind-boggling.
But the thing is, there's dozens of cities like that all across China that we just have no idea because they're in the heart of China, and millions of people live in these cities.
Right, and it's important that we at least consider that those cities are out there, so we can understand that China isn't. It's not the peasants that that were kind of like romanced in Pearl Buck's The Good Earth,
which is a great novel.
It is a great novel, and Pearl Buck is an incredible,
crazy life story.
Incredible life story.
But it's not all Chinese peasants with what's the name of
the conical hats.
With the conical hats.
No, it's not that, and it's not also the flashy like coastal Chinese nouveau riche who are sort of buying up mansions in Los Angeles.
These Chinese yuppies.
There are millions and millions and millions of people that fall in between, and those are who are going to be most impacted by the new sort of laws that are coming out and the new way China is turning.
So let's sit back and kind of work our way through like what is the actual like social, not just social structure, but like the social situation in China, because I think a lot of Americans, I'm sort of speaking for myself because more, Steve, like my idea of the stereotypical view is like there's China and it's huge and it's vast, right? And it's all homogenous and they all speak this crazy language that no one knows. And yet we often think of giant cities, right? We think of Beijing, we think of Hong Kong, we think of Shanghai, right? We think of like these giant, like 20 million people, right? We think of these, like China has become very synonymous with just massive urban centers. But that's not true. My understanding is that it's actually, there's like the eastern seaboard is where these giant population clusters are. But then as you move inland, very quickly China opens up into hugely rural areas interspersed with like a casual city of 10 million people in like a regional center. And that the real dynamic of the country is located much further inland, where the coastal cities are sort of like the LAs and the New York Cities, but as the same as in the United States, LA and New York City are not the sum total of the country.
Right, and there's definitely a pull. So like the youth are being pulled to the coastal cities because they're sexy, it's hot. You can make some money.
You're not going to necessarily end up working in like a factory or being a farmer.
Right, you can, but the money is sometimes enough money goes home to support the parents and the grandparents. And so there's that structure and that sort of dynamic where there's still a link between these like the West or the rural areas and the cities. That's not entirely gone in the way that you might see in the United States.
Yeah, because how many people move to, say, we live in Philly. How many people move to Philly from like, rural Tennessee and say, I'm going to make my fortune and send it back to my pack? No one does that anymore.
No one does that anymore, no.
But in China, as you were saying...
And that's still a thing. There's also the thing to consider, the one-child policy was around for so long.
How long was it around for?
It was from early PRC days, and it's still around in some areas. It's only been rolled back.
Since 49?
Yeah,
50s?
Very early. Because
really?
they knew they were going to have a problem right away. With the simple equation of mouths to feed versus production, it just was not sustainable, and that's something China struggled with. And this is before Green Revolution, all these kind of things happened. So what they decided to do was to limit the childbirth, and what that created was this like dynamic of both it's thrown the population out of balance, and it's also created what's called Little Emperor Syndrome, where if you only have one kid, you're going to spoil him rotten. And so there's enormous amount of pressure put on the one child, and there's an enormous amount of sort of like responsibility that they kind of have to live into that kind of keeps those rural urban links alive in a way where the United States it can't happen.
In my understanding, and this is more my understanding of traditional Han Chinese society, is that they have a sort of a bond between children and parents that really does not exist in America anymore, right? A kind of, the child will continue to take care of the parent throughout their lives, right? Like, my understanding is nursing homes, that kind of phenomenon really does not exist in China. Because, you're supposed to take your parents into your home, you take care of your parents, right? There's this kind of nature of the bond is just very different.
Yeah. And for a long time that was, that's been explained as the Confucian system of
but lots of societies do the same thing. In many European societies, many South American countries, right? That's very standard, is children take care of their parents through their old age. I mean, many people are horrified when they come to the States. They're like, you just put your parents in a nursing home? Yeah. It's like you would be like an evil person if you did this, like in my country, right? Like,
it's totally true. What's interesting about China too, in this sense, is the adoption of a communist system, which puts that power back to the state.
Yeah.
And you don't see that in Confucian societies like Korea and Japan, where much of the social services are still based on the child. And they're starting to come into problems there. But actually, I was just reading, the only part of China that's having an issue with this is Hong Kong, which was a British colony.
Yeah.
So rather than the communist system, Hong Kong, sort of adopted British ideas of social policy, and now they have a far older population. So in Hong Kong, there's many more older people who now need money. And so they're coming to a point where the mainland government is saying, well, you got to tax them more, but they don't have control over Hong Kong.
Well, my understanding is like with this notion of sort of traditional respect for the parents, is this links in with the way I've understood it as kind of a demographic cliff, like a demographic bubble that resulted from the one-child policy. Because my understanding is that in traditional Chinese society, men are considered boys, right? Having sons is considered much more prestigious, right? Because of, very traditional gender norms of privileging men. And so, of course, you're saying it's not just, little emperor, you want to spoil your kid rotten, but it's also like, damn, if I'm only be able to have one kid, I don't want a daughter. Like, daughters, like, you got to marry her off, and you don't get any, like, honor out of that. And there's, like, all this honor. So you obviously want to get a son. And my understanding is this led to just a huge, in one-child policies, right? Like, like, if parents found out they were going to have a daughter, they would just get rid of it, right? They would just abort it, or like female daughters would, if they were born, would like be killed, or they would be like shipped off somewhere. And your only official child, they would really strive to have a boy. My understanding is you do this for decades, you end up with just an hugely skewed gender disparity of millions more men than there are women. Right. And so the problem then becomes this, just the sheer numbers game. Not all these men are going to be able to get married to Chinese women? And then how are these men then going to create a household that can take care of their aging parents? And so my understanding is that soonish, right, within like the next decade or two, is that these are just things I've read, is China's really going to be facing a crisis of what's going to happen to all of these single men and all these older citizens as their sons try to take care of them by themselves.
Yeah, and this is actually an excellent sort of segue into talking about China in its regional responsibility and in its regional role as sort of like China calls itself Zhongguo, center country. To China, China is the center of the world.
But almost more than America, right? We live in America, we think we are the center of the world.
But they say it.
But they they call themselves. Like, it's not just that they think it, it's like officially they are the center of the world.
But and so if you take that in the way they are geographically positioned in Asia and then think about these issues, so having the gender imbalance is only one issue, but it's an important one, and regionally China can take advantage of its place. So North Korea, another communist state that is in immense poverty and heavily reliant on Chinese investment, has a pretty good gender balance. So North Korea, women who are unmarried, who are starving, who want to leave North Korea, have a way to leave. And this is another thing I saw.
They marry Chinese men.
Jilin, north of North Korea, has an enormous North Korean population of North Korean women coming to China and marrying a Chinese husband so they can leave North Korea. They're open to the 21st century.
And it is win-win for both single Chinese men who are having a hard time finding available Chinese women, and it's, of course, win for the North Korean woman who would be leading a terrible life in North Korea otherwise. But the thing is, are there enough North Korean women to even begin to try and equal out this gender disbalance?
Well, a couple things it does. It's destabilizing North Korea. So then you have more men.
Yeah, because in North Korea, they're like, what are these Chinese doing taking all our women?
And if history has taught us anything, societies that have more men than women tend to get violent rather quickly.
Yeah.
And
China has tens of millions of men that will likely never get married.
Right, and throughout history, it's sort of been wars that have killed off the men and put the gender imbalance the other way. But this is definitely a unique situation, and China can't keep pulling from North Korea and the Philippines. It's only going to last so long.
So are Chinese men starting to leave China then? I mean, is that an option that they would think that they want to leave in order to find a mate?
Well, I think it's only an option for those who are wealthy. Yet, as we were talking about earlier today, China is opening economic opportunities in Africa, in the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Now,
But this is a broader question too, and about sort of what I would think of maybe we would call like Han Chinese chauvinism, maybe Han Chinese kind of nationalism. Is it socially acceptable, for example, for a Han Chinese man to marry someone who's not Han Chinese?
Right, that would not be. That's not standard, right?
That's not standard, because I'm thinking in America, right, we have all kinds of like, thankfully no longer like officially encoded in law, like interracial marriage is legal, but there's still certainly vast social taboos about, who can marry who, interracial couplings this way and that way, because of course it's always like stereotypical that if a white man is not going to marry a white woman, he's going to end up with like an Asian woman.
Right.
But then of course there's all these like horrific, like jokes or kind of subtle things about if an Asian man has a relationship with a white woman, right? Let alone talking about, interactions between white people and black people in the States. And I'm wondering if that same dynamic is similar for Han Chinese. If a Han Chinese man brings back, for example, say a white wife from Eastern Europe, or like say a black wife from Africa, is that sustainable within Chinese society right now?
Yeah, and that's amazing. Like you've sort of pinpointed how like in America it's it's an issue, and in China it's amplified. Like times,
so it's even worse.
It's
in China.
Way worse. Yeah, because the concept of nation and the concept of being Chinese is it's not something like the United States where you can just immigrate to the United States and follow the right channels, or even not sometimes, and become an American eventually. There's no concept of...
Because to be in China, my understanding is you need to be...
Chinese.
Which usually means Han, right? It usually means Han, even though we've said, right, China is a vastly multi-ethnic society. This also leads to what we in the States think of as like racism.
Yes.
China is actually a very racist society in terms of privileging the Han over lots of other people.
And you can talk about that privileging in terms of language of education for Tibetans being taught Mandarin, and there's certainly an argument that it's economically more viable for them to learn Mandarin in primary school. But of course, this is the same way we think of like when people talk about learning Spanish in America, we always know there's a very heavy racial element to that. Absolutely.
We're always talking about, it's like fears in America, right, of people who, from South America and Mexico taking over the country or something like this. But there's a similar dynamic happening in China.
Absolutely, yeah. And that sort of like embedded social tension is something that China's going to have to come to terms with.
Yeah, because you're saying is that sure, China's making all these investments around the world, and so of course, young single Chinese men in search of like fame, fortune, and love are going around the world, but will it be acceptable for them to make partnerships with non-Han Chinese women to deal with the demographic crisis or the gender crisis? And so then the question is, do all these Chinese men, if they do end up forming partnerships and relationships with non-Han Chinese women, do they just leave China? Do they just like never go back to China? Which is something like, are we going to see a massive diaspora, for lack of a better word, of Han Chinese men out of China just to make it?
Right, and there's...
or if they go back to China, will that change Chinese society?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing we know for sure is Chinese society is going to change, and it's going to change.
It has to change.
It has to change, and it's going to change in a lot of ways, and which is kind of contrary to the new sort of Xi Jinping thought.
Yeah.
Right?
Like China is this like bold new example, and it's forged like it's like a new pathway into capitalism in the modern world, but that's just, it can't keep working the way it has.
Right. So just a little background on that. Xi Jinping is the current leader of the People's Republic of China, and he was just formally, given basically carte blanche to do what he thinks is good for China.
And this is because, according to my understanding, it's the Chinese Constitution, the Chinese Communist Constitution. It encoded within the Constitution initially what it called Mao Zedong thought, which basically said we are a nation based on the thought of Mao Zedong, and it basically gave Mao kind of an imprimatur to be like, do whatever you want, Mao. You are the leading sort of philosophical person. And then, of course, Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, arguably perhaps the most important human being of the 20th century, for basically doing the economic liberalization of China and leading it to take on a leading role in the global economy and to become a more capitalist power. He was also enshrined in the Constitution, so there's also officially Deng Xiaoping thought. Mm-hmm. And stunningly, Xi Jinping has had the same thing happen to him, and there is now officially Xi Jinping thought, which puts him on the same pedestal with Mao.
And that's absolutely enormous. And he doesn't have, his presidential term doesn't end until 2022, so he's got time to work with that. And the Chinese Constitution is very clear. The first article, or what it's right there. It says the Communist Party is a dictatorship in the People's Republic of China. It knows what is best, and it's going to do it.
And it's based on the thought of Mao, Deng Xiaoping, and now Xi Jinping.
And his thought, his way, his idea of going forward, his promise is that like this sort of socialist utopia is on its way. That China is marching towards a socialist utopia, and that economics is going to get it there.
And it's funny because in a way it almost links up with more traditional Marxism, where it's like, we're not going to fight a revolution, we're just going to build up capitalism, and because history follows in these inevitable stages, capitalism will create the conditions for communism. Almost this kind of like, I don't know if you've ever heard of this theory called accelerationism. If you just like hyperdrive capitalism, you'll get communism faster. And it almost seems as if China has taken that route to, well, we're just going to full-throatedly embrace capitalism, all the while telling people that eventually this will lead to communism.
Right. And if you talk to Chinese people, they will say, communism, we just aren't there yet. It's on its way.
It's coming. Yeah.
It's a point that we just have not quite arrived to.
Which is something it's hard for a lot of Americans because we look, or even analysts of China, because they say like, how can they really believe in communism, right? Like, what do you mean? They're like a totally capitalist country. And yet, if you go and talk to them, they think that what they're doing is totally in line with communism.
Right, and so that will be something to keep in mind, and especially with these sort of social imbalances. But another thing to keep in mind too is the militarization and sort of the regional challenges, like talking about if a World War III type situation would happen. And a lot of people tend to look at North Korea because North Korea has the missiles and the saber rattling, and they're doing
crazy people,
right?
Yeah.
But not a lot of people talk about the South China Sea. So where China is reclaiming land, China is building bases and challenging all the regional powers. So China's challenging the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan,
India, Japan, even Russia to a degree, Mongolia. And then, of course, we forget that China does border Afghanistan. It borders, these Central Asian
Pakistan,
states.
India,
Pakistan.
Yeah. So those are all points of tension that could really explode that are not on the forefront.
Things that could explode. I think it's funny that Americans, right? We always think that if the end of the world's going to come, it's gonna be because of us, right? It's just really funny. Like even in our pessimism, we're chauvinists, right? We're like America first. Like if there's gonna be a World War III, it's because America's gonna get in a war with somebody.
The aliens attack the White House.
The aliens are always going to attack America first, right?
That's why District 9 was so good. It takes place in South Africa.
Yeah. Whereas if there's going to be another global conflict, it very likely could occur with little action by America initially. It could be China bumping heads with Japan, China bumping heads with North Korea, China bumping heads with India or Pakistan, and actually in any number of different ways.
The issue is if, say, like North Korea falls apart, then the United States no longer has legal recourse for being in South Korea. The United States is legally in South Korea because it is technically defending South Korea.
Because we never technically. Peace was never officially declared in the Korean War.
Right.
And so technically, like on paper, America and South Korea are still at war with North Korea.
Which gives us justification for being there. But should North Korea collapse peacefully in some way and China and South Korea agree to set up a new, sort of inter-period state, a new North Korea, the U.S. would have no reason to be in South Korea, and China would probably challenge that. In a different situation, say China and Vietnam start fighting in the South China Sea and Taiwan gets involved, or China and Taiwan start fighting, then the question becomes, does the USA involve itself? And that's where the sort of turn to a world conflict
And this is
begin.
Also something, as my understanding, is that Taiwan still claims to be the rightful government of China.
Right.
And we still, on paper, support Taiwan. Or has that had changed? Or do we recognize the PRC as the official Chinese government?
Yeah,
I'm not quite sure.
We recognize the PRC as the government of China, and the United Nations has done since the 70s.
Yeah.
In fact, I think the only state that represents the Republic of China as the rightful government of China is the Vatican City.
Oh, wow.
Because, the Vatican City got into the whole
But we're still allied with Taiwan.
Yes, but we support Taiwan with weapons. We support Taiwan.
Yeah.
Almost
and so to give a little background to this, there's so Imperial China breaks down in 1912, and then what comes to power is the Kuomintang, which is sort of like a nationalist party claiming that they're going to modernize China. They're going to kind of organize it along sort of semi-socialist lines and modernize it and create a modern state that will regain the glory of old imperial China, and they're going to kick out, all these degenerate, ugly European imperialists, and they're going to, for lack of a better word or term, make China great again. Well, there's another party at work, aka the Communist Party, which is established in the early 1920s, like 1921-22. Mao Zedong joins when he's a young guy studying, I think in Beijing. He opens a branch of the Communist Party. And very quickly, right, you see political conflict occur between the Kuomintang, which claims to be the rightful government and is leader over what is then officially the Republic of China, and the communists who say, no, we want to get rid of this Republic of China business and like create a communist state. And basically they break down into a civil war.
Well, before that, the Japanese invade.
Well, okay. And then, of course,
yeah,
their friendly neighbors to the east, Japan, right, going through sort of its own version of fascism, decides it wants to create kind of a regional empire. They invade Manchuria, which freaks everybody out. And so the communists and the Kuomintang kind of get along. They still fight. It's like a really weird, low-level kind of civil war situation. And then, what is it, 1937 that the Japanese invade mainland China?
Yeah.
And then the Japanese invade mainland China. And, of course, it's horrible. I mean, we don't talk about it enough in the States, but the war that occurred in China between the Kuomintang and the communists versus the Japanese, and also still at the same low level between the Kuomintang and the communists. It's like a three-way war. Killed tens of millions of Chinese. It was absolutely bloody.
This opens wounds in the Communist Party that continue to fester
to this day. And so we're giving you a very like 30,000 foot up point of view of 20th century Chinese history. But it's important is that eventually the Japanese are, of course, defeated. They withdraw from China. But the majority of all Chinese casualties, Chinese war combat deaths, and the majority of where all of Japan's combat units were sent was China.
Yeah.
If we think about it, we think of it, and again, sort of American chauvinism, we think, yeah, we were fighting the Japanese and we were the main enemy. In the eyes of the Japanese, their main enemy was China, not the United States. And the reason they even bombed Pearl Harbor is because they were thinking of it as just a contingency, just in case America got involved. The whole focus of Japan's efforts in World War II was focused on China.
And the thing is, like, this is classic sort of communism rising against anti-imperial forces. Yeah. So they see Japan, which is rightfully so. Japan is an empire invading, trying to colonize. They colonized Manchukuo, Manchuria.
Because they want to establish a Japanese empire in China.
Right. And China has been watching Korea for the last 30 years at this point, and Japan has colonized Korea, has banned the Korean language, has made all Koreans adopt Japanese names, China is very afraid of this. And so that's sort of the bedrock of that communist resistance.
Yeah. And so communism gets a lot of its initial kind of what we think of legitimacy from basically the broad scale Chinese population, because before it's a really radical party, really only among like students and the literate, right? The vast majority of the population is just like a Chinese population is just sort of like trying to live their lives and grow enough rice to survive from one day to the next. It's during the fight against Japan that the communists are seen as like this noble fighting force, So really they get legitimacy not by being communist, but by being seen as like anti-imperialists against the Japanese.
Right, and when it lapses into civil war, in fact...
it lapses right after, basically there's like no end, right? Right after the Japanese withdraw from China, the Kuomintang and the communists now realize, all right, now it's time for the final power struggle for who's going to rule China. And so we can think of World War II as like really just one portion of a broader civil war that's going on within China itself.
Absolutely. And the Chinese battles between these like sort of loosely affiliated Kuomintang who have like warlords in each city, these very powerful business people and military veterans of the war are very loosely associated, a lot of powerful personalities, and the communists are kind of relegated to the outskirts. But this is where Mao begins his long march. He goes through the mountains, he goes through western China, and he encounters these illiterate peasants. And if you study the ways of revolution, talking to peasants, convincing them of the horrors that they've seen. And these are raw horrors. So these communist fighters had fought against the Japanese. So these stories were probably real and vivid. And the wounds were there, the battles were there, and the peasants were not doing well. The peasants couldn't read. The peasants had very little understanding.
And the thing is also we should remember is that the broader Chinese population, though, still remembered the glory days, right? When they used to be an empire. And of course, as we were talking earlier, kind of this like Han Chinese kind of chauvinism that we are the middle kingdom, we're the central country, right? We are the best people and we were the best empire. and how low have we fallen. And so when the communists during the Civil War go around, they really talk up that they're going to reclaim the glory of old China.
China for the Chinese.
And it really, really gains them a lot of support. And so the Kuomintang and the Chinese communists fight a really brutal civil war, officially a civil war, when effectively they've been fighting each other for like over 20 years at this point. Chinese communists finally win in 1949, but where does the surviving Kuomintang leadership go?
Yeah, long story short, and as
they go to a neighboring island off the shore of China, Taiwan,
which had been a former Japanese colony, which had its own indigenous population. But the Kuomintang goes and takes along with it its loyal allies, as well as China's finest art. So if you ever want to see ancient Chinese art, you should go to Taiwan, not Beijing, because the Kuomintang took that too.
Yeah, and then the Kuomintang in Taiwan claim that they are the Republic of China, and they are the rightful government.
And the United Nations says, all right.
And they claim that one day they will go back to mainland China and take what is rightfully theirs. And the United States initially backs
the United States agrees, Britain agrees, France agrees, and the Republic of China gets the seat at the United Nations.
Which is, when you think of it, like, Taiwan is tiny compared to all of mainland China.
And what this also sets off throughout the world, and you read these speeches, Ernesto Guevara, when he gives a speech to the United Nations, he says, recognize the People's Republic of China. This is in 1964. He's asking the United Nations to actually recognize People's Republic of China, so mainland China, as China.
Yeah, and so it's really wild because this becomes a major issue in the Cold War is, do you or do you not recognize the People's Republic of China, the communist government? Eventually, everybody does go around to doing that because they realize, like, we can't keep supporting this tiny island when, like, on the mainland, it's like the largest country population-wise, and there's just, like, no way you can ignore it geopolitically. So eventually, every country just sort of, like, by the sheer geopolitical fact of its existence is forced to recognize the People's Republic of China as the real Chinese government, but it takes a few decades.
Yeah, and not to mention a few wars
and a few wars. And so that's where Taiwan is in this weird situation where you're saying only Vatican City officially recognizes it anymore, but America is still Taiwan's main ally, where we say that the People's Republic of China is the official government of China, but we give money and weapons to Taiwan. And this thing that happened with Trump earlier this year, right, is that, you know, the American president is never, like, supposed to just, like, casually ring up the Taiwanese government because that's seen by the PRC as giving legitimacy to Taiwan. And of course the PRC claims that Taiwan is illegitimate, that one day Taiwan will be theirs again, and the PRC claims that Taiwan is actually part of their jurisdiction.
Even at the Olympics, Taiwan has to compete as Chinese Taipei.
Yeah, and so it's just this really crazy geopolitical situation. And the Chinese mainland, right, the PRC is very patient, right? They're saying, like, one day we will get Taiwan back.
And so that's a point of conflict. And then you also take into effect Taiwan has good relations with us. Taiwan also operates, its presidential palace is the colonial building of Imperial Japan. And so Taiwan has no ill will, which is very strange for a former colony. Korea has enormous animosity, both north and south, towards Japan after the colonialism.
China has huge animosity to Japan.
Enormous animosity. You look at African nations, Latin American nations, there's uneasy relationships. Yet, because Taiwan is in such a poor position itself in terms of independence, it appeals even to the Japanese, and it respects the Japanese, and it expects the Japanese to defend it, because Taiwan knows if a conflict should happen between them and mainland China, they would call upon the Japanese, they would call upon the Americans.
Yeah, and so it's a very troubled geopolitical relationship, to put it mildly.
Right.
But to go back to sort of our main historical story here, so you're like, what happens to China after they win the Civil War, but no country in the world recognizes them except for the Soviet Union? They're isolated. Nobody will open up diplomatic relations with them. No one will trade with them. And they don't want to trade because they are also a communist country.
And they begin agrarian reform.
They've been under basically wartime conditions for decades. Tens of millions of their population are destroyed. But that doesn't stop Mao.
No, and Mao begins his whole reform agenda, and this is where
in the 50s and most extremely in the 60s,
right, with his great leap forward and
the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, and you know he starts he ushers in this era of famine. He talks about the 4, sort of curses on Chinese agriculture, and he implores the peasants to kill all the sparrows. But the problem is the sparrows eat the crickets, and then so there's a lot of crickets. So then they kill all the crickets. But the problem is the crickets, So he creates this ecological nightmare that results in famine and millions and millions of deaths.
At least, so Mao comes into power. They're dealing with just like the after effects of like decades-long war for like about a decade. And then finally Mao gets down to business in the latter half of the 50s when he says, all right, damn it, we need to create communism. So what do? They look to the Soviet Union, which is like their main model at the time, and they say, well, we're going to do what Stalin did. Stalin collectivized agriculture and killed the wealthy peasants. So Mao and the leadership say, we'll just do the same thing. And so in 1958, they institute the Great Leap Forward, which is meant to be this giant economic restructuring program across all of China that will create true conditions for communism, largely based on collectivizing agriculture. And as Steve said, does not go well.
as it did in the Soviet Union.
Yeah. But even worse than in the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
What is it? Like bare minimum 15 million people starved to death.
At the very least.
That's what the Chinese government officially says.
We have
and
no idea.
You can't get the Chinese government to admit to any atrocity committed by it without pulling teeth. So if the Chinese government itself is like, 15 million people died, way more people died. So what? I think it's the highest I've heard is like 50 million.
Yeah, I've heard up to 60.
I've heard up to 60. Yeah. And so the problem is, and I think for a lot of historians, we may never know how many people starved to death. Number one, because a lot of these people are poor, illiterate peasants. They don't have birth certificates. There's not there's not really any remaining infrastructure. There's no records of these people due to the wars that were fought before. And then of course the restructuring of society under the communists. And then of course the communist government has absolutely zero incentive to investigate this and to preserve records of it.
And there's no Time magazine walking around.
And also because, as we said earlier, because no one has diplomatic relations with China, China is a closed society. China effectively, up until the normalizations with the United States in the early 70s under Nixon, China for about 25 years is completely isolated from the outside world. Its borders are closed. You can't get in, you can't get out. And no one knows what's happening in China, basically, for decades.
And we should really just take a second there to reflect on that.
Which is crazy.
Yes. So we're talking relatively recent history, right? The 1970s. China is a mystery.
Yeah, no one knows what's happening there.
China is vastly underdeveloped. The literacy is improving. People are still recovering from famine. It's enormous to think how far China today has come from that point. And that was sort of the low point for the People's Republic of China, the post-reform, the famines and things like that. And then when it lapsed into the Cultural Revolution, where it was a total switch. Doctors were sent to the fields.
Yeah. But let's tease out this narrative even more. So Great Leap Forward happens.
Yes.
They're forced to, they're originally doing a 5-year plan based on the Soviet Union. They stop it in 4 because even the Chinese leadership under Mao has to realize they can't keep doing what they're doing or everyone is going to starve to death. Anywhere between 15 million and 60 million people die. Absolute madness, right? But then even after they stop the Great Leap Forward, Mao still is crazy enough to think that they need to do more. And so, 1966, 68, he institutes the Cultural Revolution, which is the idea that they're going to do basically a continuation of class warfare. As you said, the idea is, to get people class conscious and to uplift the peasantry, we're going to basically remove all educated people, professionals, technicians, scientists, professors, anyone with any kind of learning. Even in its crudest, they would take anyone with glasses and they would took them from the cities and they shipped them off into the countryside. And they would literally just take them in trains and in buses, and just dump them. Yeah. And then just throw some plows to them and some tools and just say, good luck. And then they would bus in millions of peasants into cities, dump them and say, good luck. And then they also organized student brigades to go around and actively enforce social warfare. So you have crazy stories of like brigades of young Chinese students going into an area and killing thousands of people because they're trying to advance social or class conflict along communist lines.
Right, and this is, so to contextualize this a little bit, this is where Xi Jinping has his childhood.
Yeah.
So he
grows up in the middle of basically just
the Cultural Revolution.
Just like and total social upheaval.
He is a child of peasants who benefited from the Cultural Revolution. So his parents moved to the city and he's able to get an education. So without the Cultural Revolution, Xi Jinping is actually stuck out in who knows where, China.
But the Cultural Revolution is also incredibly violent. Also,
absolutely,
we have no idea how many people died. I don't even know.
Just think of it this way.
A few million?
This is always my best example of the Cultural Revolution. You have a pregnant wife, and it's time to have a baby. Let's take her to the hospital. Okay, who's going to give birth to the baby? The wife gives birth, but who's going to deliver it? Well, doctors have all been sent to the fields, but we have Mao's Red Guard. So a bunch of basically radical communists who are, between the age of 10 and 20, who know Chairman Mao quotations but know very little about delivering babies, are there to help. Yeah. So you have to give birth, no idea of sanitation, nothing like that.
And so it's not that it's even explicitly violent, but just like the violence that occurs from the social upheaval is massive.
Massive.
But then, which makes the stunning rise of China even more stunning.
Even more amazing.
You have a society that basically loses tens of millions of people starting from 1912 until the death of Mao in 1976. I mean, probably 100 million people die prematurely. Bare minimum.
Bare minimum.
I mean, we're talking about a society that lived through at least 2 or 3 decades of continuous warfare, invasion, civil war, and then massive famine, right? And then they go through a total social upheaval, and then Mao dies. But not before Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, in talks with Mao and Zhao Enlai, establish a normalization of relationships. Probably the most important event of the Cold War, in my opinion, because it assured that America and China would not have to worry about each other. Mm-hmm. And then America could focus all of its attention on the Soviet Union.
And just the sort of switch in the railroad tracks after that moment where China becomes a recognized nation to the world. It gains legitimacy despite its communist government. There's relations. People like George H.W. Bush go to China, and interaction begins. And through those interactions, this sort of opening up starts, right? There has to be a seed of opening up.
So Mao dies, and then there's a power struggle, of course. And then who ends up getting into power? This random guy, Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping was a tiny man, probably barely topped 5 feet tall. The
pictures of him are excellent.
Yeah, he's very wizened. He's wearing this military style kind of uniform, right? This man was probably the most important person of the 20th century because he institutes a lot of radical economic reforms starting in the late 70s through the 80s that take China from a war-torn, backwards, completely, utterly sort of devastated society. And within 25 years, China becomes one of the largest economies in the world.
And interestingly, Deng Xiaoping rather than start in the super communist north, he starts right on the border of modernities. Right across from Hong Kong, in Shenzhen, in Guangzhou, all those southern cities that are just very close to sort of the modern Macau, owned by the Portuguese, and Hong Kong by the British, and sort of just, we're going to challenge them right there. And the images of those cities exploding in Shanghai, these become modern way before the capital, Beijing, does, and way before the northern cities do. Yeah. So it's like, we're going to test it down south first, see how it goes. And man, did it go well.
But the thing is that so Deng just creates massive growth just because China is so large territorially, natural resources, and population-wise that any kind of economic liberalization is going to cause explosive growth. Immediately. Yeah. But not just that, it's also that people in America, the American leadership, also sees a great opportunity in talks with Deng Xiaoping, leading to conditions that are really important for the world we live in now, where the American leadership says, wait a second, and American companies, things are opening up with China, and they say, well, wait a second, why do I have this factory here in America producing this much steel, but I have to pay my workers all this damn money, and they're unionized, and they're always making demands on me. What if I just move my factory to China, where, you know, the Chinese are desperate, right? They're like begging anybody and everybody across the world, like, give us your productive capacity, bring factories here, right? They're like, and there's like a gold rush on China where big producers, particularly in the States, say, yeah, it's because you can pay these people in China dirt cheap. Mm-hmm. You don't have to worry about workplace conditions. You don't have to worry about workers' comp. You don't have to worry about unions. You just offload it, offshore it to China, and then just kind of reap the benefits and let the Chinese take care of themselves.
Slap a tag on it. Made in China.
Made in China. And so starting in the late 70s, you see a huge boom of what is in the United States a deindustrialization, but a corresponding industrialization in China. And of course, when that happens, people who own factories, they also tend to own a shitload of stock, gain a lot of money. What do? They start investing in it, helping to fuel, under Reagan, the stock market boom that just explodes, right? Like we think of like these movies like, was it Wall Street? Like, greed is good. But the thing is, that can only is possible. This huge boom in finance is only possible because these people are making money off of the productive capacity that's being moved out of the United States to China.
And there had been, you know, the boom of the Asian tigers. So like South Korea and Singapore had already had enormous economic growth. So the world knew about that. And the world had seen places like South Korea modernize rapidly. But China is such an amazingly different scale that it both, of course, people were excited and riding the economic wave of China to their own economic success. But at the same time, they were frightened. Can this nation keep up this extreme growth? Japan had enormous growth rate for many years that led to a real depression in Japanese society that, you know, sort of culminated in the underground Tokyo terrorist attacks, where people were joining cults, like trying to find themselves, you know, trying to avoid that salaryman life. And the scale of China made that sort of thought that could happen in China just absolutely horrifying to the world. Yet from the 1970s on into the present day, and we're only seeing it sort of drop under 10% down towards 6% growth per year, the China has kept up an enormous growth rate that is simply unsustainable.
Yeah, no country, and indeed no region of the world, can maintain double-digit growth indefinitely. It's impossible.
And they held on for so long.
And so long. But the problem, so that's the thing also, but we're seeing the effects is that, you know, for so long, so many companies and like American businesses offloaded and offshored to China, which of course led to, of course, the joke in America that everything's made in China. Because effectively,
it was.
But again, we're seeing under basically economic nationalists, kind of racial nationalists, make America great again, folks. Donald Trump, like these trade deals, right? People around the world are starting to be a little skeptical that offloading things to China, investing in China, is good for them anymore. It's good for the nation, or is it really just good for China?
Right.
But then we're also seeing China running into the problem of, is its growth sustainable given this demographic and gender sort of bubble that it's about to hit exponentially right now? The question of, how's it going to produce more workers? The question also is environmental effects. This kind of rapid industrialization resulted in just unimaginisable levels of pollution in the Chinese countryside,
and a lot of Chinese
and also
cities.
under the communists, because they didn't give a damn about the environment, and so those effects are going to hit them very quickly. Climate change and the rising of sea levels obviously going to devastate coastal Chinese cities, which are also the biggest cities in China.
And so what we're left with, who we have to lead China out of all these problems, through all these problems, and into the new era, is a child of the Cultural Revolution, a man who claims to have the thought that's going to bring China to a socialist utopia and deliver on the promises of communism that Mao sort of put in place.
Yeah.
Decades ago.
And we will see, because Xi Jinping famously, 2 or 3 years ago, came out with his book. It was sort of a collection of his speeches and essays called On the Governance of China.
Right.
And for a little while, it was like the thing of all the literati intelligentsia folks in America had to read. Like Mark Zuckerberg read it, you know. And it's interesting, there's this fetish for China among a broad swath of like kind of top tier people in America, right? Like our children got to learn Chinese, got to read Xi Jinping, got to like establish relationships with the Chinese businesses, Chinese leadership. And so, right, like when Trump went and visited China, his granddaughter, he famously played a video of his granddaughter speaking Mandarin. Mm-hmm. So this idea, right, is that China on the rise, there's this perception that we need to like start like, for lack of a better word, sucking up to China.
But interestingly...
is that necessarily the case?
Interestingly, it also works in the reverse. And this is the old Michael Scott, The Office defense. He has a debate.
Oh, I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's a great episode. And Michael Scott comes to the conclusion that Americans have this sort of spirit or creativity, right? Which it has its own problems. But Xi Jinping sent his daughter to Harvard University. So there's still this exchange. Chinese are still coming to America. They're consuming American film. So if you watch American film, there's enormous amount of like sort of fan service to China. They're starting to take place in China.
Or you see big movies that maybe tank in the States, like still become global like hits because of China. And so it's this weird tension is that can the Communist Party still maintain its leadership role in China in the future? Also because China still has press censorship, media censorship, internet censorship, and yet and so they're in this sort of weird rock and a hard place situation where they want the economy to keep booming, they want to keep opening up, and yet the party still wants to maintain control.
Right.
But you can't, but those things are antithetical to each other. And so what's going to happen?
We used to troll each other, and if you search on Chinese internet any of the 3 T's, Tiananmen Square, Taiwan, or Tibet, immediately your internet goes off. Yeah. So we would troll each other and type it in, and then the internet would be off for a few hours. But China, the way to get around that is a VPN to hide your IP. But China has promised within the next couple of years to block VPNs. They're hired thousands of Chinese to write a Chinese Wikipedia. So they will have their own version of the world to portray to their own citizens. This Xi Jinping thought is real.
And so it's a question of, is this sort of dynamic sustainable and what's going to happen? And also because the Chinese elite, as you were saying, love to take advantage of the perks of the West. Mm-hmm. But they're never going to create their own Harvards in China if they keep the same social structure going that keeps them in power. And also the Chinese Communist Party has essentially kind of become just a nepotism machine. Yeah. Right? The sons and daughters of the Chinese leadership get the best jobs. Right. They travel abroad. They also usually get like positions in the party. And so the question is, how long is that sustainable within broader China itself? Mm-hmm. And it's something I think is going to be a very defining issue for China, is this relationship of how's the party going to govern. Because everyone was shocked, right, when the USSR collapsed and it wasn't like incredibly violent. They were like, oh my God, it could have been.
It could have been.
And so the question is, could something like that happen in China, or would it be violent if it happened?
Yeah.
Because the Chinese government has shown itself perfectly willing to,
shoot its own citizens.
In the case of Tiananmen Square. Yeah. In a way that the Soviet Union was not willing to do. Right. And so the tensions within China are going to be really, really, really important for not just, because it's like the biggest country in the world population-wise, but also because of its sheer economic power. If anything crazy happens in China, it's going to affect everybody globally.
Exactly. And so as we come, to our conclusion here, if nothing else, one thing that you should take away from this is not necessarily that you have to go full Zuckerberg and learn Chinese or not, but it's important to know that the country is out there and that what happens in China will impact you.
Definitely.
No matter where you are.
Another fun fact, there are more English speakers in China than there are in the United States.
All right. And with that, Matthias, with that wonderful fact, we will say 再见 and have a good night.
Have a good one.
At an hour and 4 minutes. That's your hour of history.